When many people think of US democracy, as maybe we've already seen here, people tend to think about images like this. This is what stock photos come up when you search on democracy. Dr. Anderson might note that most of these are male affiliated images. My mind tends to go here, right, to places like this, characters like this, right? Now, this is not a radical idea. The notion that, in fact, we might look to cultural performances, theater, other kinds of cultural events. I'm going to go to my script here. For notions of how we think about politics is not a radical idea. This goes all the way back to our roots as human cultures. We can find this idea in anthropology and archaeology. David Graeber and David Wengrow recently write that theater and performance and other kinds of cultural practices constitute a zone of ritual play that has acted as a site of social experimentation. It provides an encyclopedia of social possibilities from which future cultures can draw from, including a whole panoply of formal democratic procedures like election and sortition. Right? So that's from Graeber and Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything. In short, they argue, as do I, that cultural performances often harbor our fantasies for good governance and also signify our cautionary tales, right? We can see this in the whole history of theater, right? Greek tragedies tell us this, Shakespearean histories teach us this. And in my research, I trace this trend to the present moment, where I'm looking for trends and threads for the political in performance. One strand I see happening across the US is a desire to stage what I call a utopian public sphere, a place where democratic deliberation can happen without the friction that we often see in daily lives, right? When I say fantasy, I mean fantasy in a couple of different ways, all happening at once, right? At one level, a fantasy is a kind of imagining otherwise, a hope for what we might imagine could be if everything kind of worked the way we wanted to. I also note that fantasies can also be delusions, right? The ways that we might think about that imagining otherwise can delude ourselves into believing that we've already taken steps that we haven't necessarily taken. And so I think about what these fantasies on stage mean for us, both for the way that they give us an opportunity to stage reason giving, right, the kind of rational component of the public sphere, but the way that theater also creates avenues for affect, the way that we're feeling about these things as well. So in my recent book, I look at verbatim theater. Right? Verbatim theater is a fairly recent form. It's about 40 years old or so. It's a kind of documentary theater where the entire text of the play is drawn from real life, interviews, public transcripts, speeches, that sort of thing. Frequently, a single performer or group of performers going into a community after some kind of charged moment, collecting dozens, even hundreds of interviews in order to gather what that public sentiment is and stitch it into a kind of dialogue. What these things do, I think, is they show us both the kinds of issues that emerge in communities, but they also help us track shapes of feelings, of political sentiment. We can see hope, we can see empathy, we can see suspicion, we can see nostalgia, and I trace these over the course of the book. They show up both in how the performances depict democratic deliberation in their form, but also how audiences and critics respond to that, right? So, the first one of these I saw was about 27, 28 years ago, was Anna Deavere Smith in her performance Twilight Los Angeles 1992. This was a performance that was taken up in the aftermath of the LA protests following the brutal beating of Rodney King by LA police. Smith herself, as a solo performer, interviewed nearly 300 individuals, everyday people, prominent leaders, folks who were cultural commentators, folks who were involved in it, and she herself performed this. Now, I was invited, I was a first-year grad student, I was invited by a PhD student at the time. I was trying to impress this person, and I thought, all right, this is going to be like consuming my theatrical vitamins, very enriching, not necessarily exciting. And I came out transfixed. Right? I've been thinking about this performance ever since. This was a person who, in a span of just over 90 minutes, played 30 different characters, moving seamlessly from character to character across racial identities, across gender identities, across classes, across political lines, to change not just how I thought about that issue that was an important moment in my life, but also my ability to empathize with those characters' positionalities within that issue. Right? And to me, this was a key moment. Now, Anna Deavere Smith is the godparent of this form, right? People have been now emulating her work. Most people around here, the first example they think of, or they might be introduced to, is the Laramie Project, right? Which is the same kind of format about the murder of Matthew Shepard, which took place just across the Wyoming border. As part of my work on this, I noted, in fact, that Matthew Shepard died a mile away from where my office is, over in the hospital just here in town. Now, when we think about these plays, one of the things that we've noticed is plays like the Laramie Project, they've become prestige theater, right? They are some of the most popular, what we might think of as art performances happening in regional theaters around the country. And like most prestige theaters, their audiences skew in a particular way. They skew white, they skew middle class, they skew politically liberal. So what I look at is that when we look at the history of this form, we also see a recent history of liberal political sentiment, right? Throughout that, we can also start to trace some features of what that fantasy looks like as a kind of liberal political construction, right? So these plays, as they construct these interviews into a narrative, they often focus on representative voices, right? Getting voices from lots of positionalities. They construct a kind of model for citizenship, but that model for citizenship is also often a little more capacious than what we might think of, right? People from the margins are offered space at the center. It often focuses everyday voices, not just political elites, but often everyday voices alongside political elites. It focuses on appearing even-handed, and that's an important appearance, right? Which is to say that even though these performances often have a shift or a drift one direction or another, they end up being open-ended. They refuse to draw a political conclusion, hoping that audiences will find their point of identification somewhere on that stage and reach their own conclusions. Now, I would argue that this is a good start for democratic deliberation. And by adding that element of affect, we can start seeing how feeling and emotion comes to play here. And that those feelings and emotions change over history. So in the multicultural 90s, we see a lot of work that is predicated on the idea of empathetic listening across difference, right? These are all performances from the work of Ping Chong and company, which staged people. These are the actors on the stage are speaking their own stories, often about discrimination around ethnicity, or in this case, about physical disability. There's another performance about refugees. But then these things change over time. So during the Iraq War period, suspicion emerges in this form. We see a lot of performances that deal with issues of trust, both in terms of these kind of large political events, but here's another one that emerged more recently in the teens around staging political polarization. The emergence of these also tracks with our understanding of political polarization as it charts out in social science as well. What I noticed as I was writing this book in 2020 and 2021, though, was a turn toward nostalgia that I thought was very interesting. We started to see some of those classic performances of the 90s being revised, right? Anna Deavere Smith had two of her most famous performances performed by another actor for the first time, and then a cast of 5. The Laramie Project does a 10 years later one where they actually return to the scene. And then it also shows up in repertory with shows like Our Town, right? Old Chestnuts. In fact, one that we're doing here at the University Center for Arts just this year, but that this notion that this is somehow classic American culture suggests a kind of nostalgia for another time. A time like those multicultural 90s when we, white, middle-class, liberal audiences like me, believed that political pluralism could exist, believed that it could emerge simply from empathetic dialogue. It was a time when people like this came to power. Again, we might notice something about that. And oh, this guy. Talk about political nostalgia. So, as we anxiously, collectively chart the future of our democratic institutions, I will absolutely be listening to my colleagues for their insights and their wisdom, but I'll also be going to the theater to see what we're feeling about that. Thanks.